Deep within the humid embrace of the cypress swamp, young Barnaby was lost in a blur of red dragonflies and tangled mossy roots. It was a morning of golden haze and soft, rhythmic splashes, until the earth itself betrayed them. Without warning, the sodden bank groaned, sending a massive limestone slab crashing down in a spray of silt. The impact muffled a cry that no mother should ever hear. Ursa lunged forward, her massive frame trembling against the cold, unyielding stone. But as the muddy tide began to crawl toward her cub's muzzle, the forest's most feared predator faced a terrifying truth. Her strength was utterly useless against the rising weight of the swamp. Ursa reached the bank in a flurry of dark fur and desperate speed. In this corner of the swamp she was the undisputed law, a 500-pound engine of muscle and bone capable of snapping a cypress trunk. She threw her massive frame against the limestone slab, her claws carving deep, frantic grooves into the wet stone as she tried to find purchase. She lunged, her neck muscles bunching and straining under her coat, pushing with the raw, legendary power that had always seen her through. But the swamp offered no solid ground. For every frantic surge of her strength, the soft, waterlogged earth simply gave way. Her paws skidded through the slick silt, providing no leverage, no hope. Instead of lifting, the heavy stone groaned and settled even deeper into the mire, pinning Barnaby further into the suffocating mud. The very power that made Ursa a queen was suddenly, terrifyingly bankrupt. It is a common belief that in the wild, strength is the only currency that matters. We assume that an apex predator can force the world to bend to its will through sheer violence. But here, amidst the rising gray water, that assumption shattered. Her claws, meant for climbing and killing, were useless against the unyielding weight of the earth. Ursa was discovering a brutal truth. Nature does not care how strong you are when the tide begins to turn. The threat was no longer just the stone. The swamp water, dark and choked with sediment, was crawling upward. It began to lap at Barnaby's chin, then his muzzle. The cub's cries were no longer sharp. They were becoming wet, bubbling gasps of terror. Ursa dug at the mud until her paws bled, but the limestone remained a silent, immovable tomb. In that moment of crushing realization, the predator was gone. What remained was a mother forced to realize that to save her son, she would have to abandon her pride, her territory, and her fear. She would have to seek mercy from the one creature she had been taught to avoid at all costs. The scent of copper drifted through the stagnant air, a silent alarm to the swamp's oldest resident. From beneath the cypress knees, a massive alligator glided, a prehistoric silhouette barely rippling the surface. Only its armored eyes remained visible. Ursa let out a guttural roar that shook the moss, but she was trapped. To charge the water was to let Barnaby's head sink. She was forced into a desperate duality, a guardian of the surface and a warrior of the depths. Then a mechanical thrum broke the tension, a rhythmic, high-pitched whine that grew into a roar. An airboat burst through the fog, its flat hull skimming over the reeds. Dr. Davis stood at the controls, killing the ignition as the vessel slid to a halt. The sudden silence was deafening. Davis looked at the bear he had tracked for years, the Nhat that had once shredded his equipment and chased him from this very grove. Ursa rose onto her hind legs. In any other context, this was a declaration of war, but, as Davis reached for his gear, he froze. He recognized a frequency that no textbook could explain. This was a survival covenant. Ursa wasn't baring her teeth to bite. She was standing tall to show him what was hidden behind her, her trapped cub. In this moment, the predator's mask fell away. She was revealing her throat, her chest, and her gut fear to her oldest rival. It was an instinctive shift in perspective. Davis realized he wasn't looking at a monster to be subdued, but a soul in agony. The boundaries of species dissolved. The man who spent his life studying the wild suddenly understood that he was no longer an observer. He was being recruited. Ursa had identified him not as a threat, but as the only variable capable of changing the outcome of a tragedy. Ursa suddenly turned her back on the mud and the rising water. To an observer, it looked like surrender. She plunged into the churning current, her massive head bobbing as she sliced toward the center of the channel, away from her trapped son. But this was not a retreat. It was the ultimate gamble of faith. She reached the airboat, her dark fur matted and heavy. She didn't snarl. She didn't lash out. Instead, she rose from the water, her jaws clenching a tattered, sun-bleached piece of orange fabric, a life vest Dr. Davis had lost weeks earlier. This was her token. She wasn't begging for a handout. She was calling on the only being who possessed the tools to rewrite a tragedy. Davis gripped the railing, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked into those amber eyes and saw something that defied every predatory law he had ever recorded. This was the journey of faith. Every stroke Ursa took toward the boat was a betrayal of 1,000,000 years of evolutionary fear. She was venturing into a world of metal, smoke, and steel, crossing a boundary that few of her kind ever survive. She wasn't running to save her own skin. She was running toward her greatest enemy to find a miracle that the swamp simply could not provide. Davis didn't hesitate. He saw the intelligence in her gaze, a desperate, calculated trust. He slammed the boat into gear, the propeller roaring to life, and followed the black shadow as she dove back into the mist. The hunt was over. The rescue had begun. Davis didn't waste a heartbeat. He hauled the heavy steel cable from the winch, the metal hook clinking against the airboat's deck as he waded into the muck. Ursa was a mountain of black fur inches from his shoulder. He could feel the radiating heat of her body and the rhythmic, huffing pressure of her breath. One strike would end him, but her eyes weren't on his throat. They were locked on the steel cable. He engaged the motor. The winch groaned, the cable snapping taut and humming with lethal tension. The airboat's engine roared, its propeller blast flattening the marsh grass as it fought the suction of the swamp. Then a grinding, wet suction sound broke the silence. The limestone slab shivered, tilted, and finally rose just enough. Ursa shoved her muzzle into the gap, gently but firmly pulling Barnaby clear by the scruff of his neck. The cub was a shivering mess of gray silt and matted fur, but he was breathing. Davis knelt in the mud, reaching out a hand stained with engine, oil and grit to check the cub's legs. That's when the world seemed to stop. Barnaby didn't retreat. He wobbled forward on trembling limbs and purposefully pressed his head against Davis's oil-stained palm. A soft, rattling purr vibrated through the small body. We often search for miracles in the absence of pain, but the true significance of this moment lies in the reality of what survived. The bruises on Barnaby's legs were real. The bone-deep exhaustion in Ursa's eyes was real. This wasn't a scripted act, it was a biological imprint of safety. Kindness had left a mark deeper than any scar. In that swamp, the scent of machinery and the musk of the wild merged into a single, undeniable truth. That even in the most unforgiving corners of the earth, compassion can bridge the widest of chasms. Ursa nudged Barnaby toward the dark veil of the cypress grove. At the edge of the shifting mist, she stopped. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Davis one final time. This was no longer the stare of a beast measuring its prey. Davis stood on the vibrating deck of his boat, the silence of the swamp settling over him like a heavy shroud. In that look, the hierarchy of the wild flipped. He realized he was not the sovereign of this sanctuary. He was merely a technician whom nature had briefly recruited and entrusted with a miracle. We often believe we have domesticated the earth, but here the reverse was true. Ursa had identified the man's capability, bypassed his fear, and utilized him as a tool for her own mercy. As the shadows finally swallowed the massive black form and her small, wobbling cub, Davis understood a cold, beautiful truth. We are not kind because we are superior. We are kind because nature, in its infinite complexity, sometimes allows us to be useful.